My brothers, my sisters, welcome back to the channel. Today we speak not just of Burkina Faso, but of Africa's awakening. If you believe in freedom, unity, and the power of our people, then make sure you subscribe. Share this story, and let the world hear Africa's voice. Because what you are about to witness is not just history, but is destiny. The morning light of Ouagadougou came filtered through a pale haze of dust, the kind that clings to the air like memory. In the distance, a horizon shimmered with steel and smoke, where once there had been only dry soil and scattered trees. The drone of machines rose faintly, mixing with the sound of distant chanting, voices layered with both pride and fear. It was supposed to be a day of triumph. Cameras lined the roads. Journalists scribbled headlines before the event even began. And the people, the weary, sunburnt people, stood shoulder to shoulder, clutching small flags sewn from scraps of blue and green cloth. Above them, a banner fluttered. Africa's future begins here. Yet beneath the surface of celebration, something trembled. The smiles were too forced, the soldiers too alert. Even the wind seemed to carry whispers of unease. They said a shadow had fallen over the project, one that no speech could disperse, because this was not just a factory. It was a declaration of war, not fought with guns, but with looms and cotton. For centuries, Burkina Faso had grown the soft white gold of Africa, its cotton fields stretching endless under the sun. But every fiber, every thread had been shipped away, spun in foreign mills, worn by distant strangers. The farmers who grew it never touched the final fabric. The women who picked it never saw its color return. That was how it had always been, until Ibrahim Traoré decided it would not be. They called it madness at first, a textile hub of 20,000 tons of production a year, entirely owned and powered by Africans. No foreign board, no colonial contracts, just soil, sweat, and sovereignty. He stood on that promise, and the ground beneath him began to shake. Months earlier, the site had been nothing but wasteland, dry plains where locusts had more claim than men. Then came the convoys, hundreds of trucks carrying rusted steel, engines, and blueprints. Engineers arrived from across the continent, Mali, Ghana, Niger, drawn by something intangible, a kind of hunger that wasn't for bread but for purpose. Every day they worked under a sky the color of heat. They poured concrete until their hands cracked. They wired generators by the flicker of firelight. And when the first framework of the factory rose from the dust, the people began to whisper, maybe this time, the story will be different. But the world beyond the desert heard. Too far away in air-conditioned boardrooms lined with glass, men in suits stared at satellite images of the site. Unregulated, one of them said. Unapproved, another murmured. To them, the factory wasn't an achievement, it was a threat. Because if one nation could build its own textile empire, the others might follow. And the balance of profit, the silent map of who owned whom, would begin to tilt. By the time the first loom arrived, the IMF had already sent its warnings. They came as polite letters at first, written in careful, diplomatic tone, concerns regarding regional stability, the need for economic alignment. When those failed, the pressure grew. Loans were frozen, partners backed out, shipments were mysteriously delayed at ports. But Traoré pressed on. At night, the factory lights burned through the dark like defiance itself. Local farmers began arriving by donkey carts, carrying sacks of raw cotton wrapped in burlap. They lined up outside the gates for hours just to say they had brought their share. Women brought food for the workers. Soldiers stood guard not against rebels, but against thieves of hope. Yet inside the government, murmurs spread. Not everyone believed in the project. Not everyone wanted it to succeed. 3 men in particular, senior generals, began holding private meetings late into the night. They smiled in public, saluted their leader, and swore loyalty with the same mouths that whispered betrayal in secret. They feared that if the textile hub succeeded, the old ways, their ways, would vanish. One of them said quietly, "If he sews too tight, he'll strangle us all." The setup of the dream turned quickly to the architecture of suspicion. In the capital, Rumors began to flow like underground rivers. A shipment of imported dye vanished on the road from Ghana. Drivers missing, cargo gone. Weeks later, blueprints of the textile plant's power grid leaked online, traced to an anonymous account hosted in Switzerland. Then, there was the fire, the one that started in the western cotton fields. The night it happened, the sky turned orange over the plains. Farmers watched helplessly as acres of cotton, their year's labor, went up in flames. Flames that moved too fast, too deliberate to be chance. And as the smoke drifted eastward, people began to say the word no one wanted to: sabotage. Traoré visited the site at dawn. The earth was still smoldering. He picked up a handful of blackened fiber, held it between his fingers. No cameras, no speech, just silence. The kind that builds pressure beneath the skin. By then, his aides knew something bigger was coming. The days that followed blurred into a quiet chaos. International investors withdrew. Reports accused the government of unsafe industrial practices. Western media ran headlines predicting the project's collapse. Aid packages were halted. Even regional allies hesitated to speak out. But the people didn't stop working. Every night, the factory continued to rise, its massive steel skeleton stretching like a monument to defiance. It became more than a building. It was a pulse beating against the odds. Tailors from small towns began sending handwritten letters to the capital, offering their skills. Schools started teaching textile design for the first time in decades. In the streets, children played with scraps of unprocessed cotton, pretending they were building their own nations. Still, there were those who wanted to see it fall. Late one night, a convoy of trucks carrying imported spinning machines never arrived. The official report said, mechanical breakdown. The unofficial truth was darker. The convoy had been ambushed, the drivers missing, the equipment stolen before reaching Burkina's border. Inside the presidential offices, fatigue began to sink in. The walls seemed to hum with the echo of unanswered phone calls. Some of his ministers urged him to delay the project, to accept partnerships with foreign textile firms, even if it meant ceding control. But Traoré refused. His words were few, his resolve absolute. And somewhere deep in the night, as generators hummed and blueprints sprawled across the table, an aide discovered a coded message slipped under his door, unsigned. Sealed in black, it contained coordinates, and a single line typed in bold: "They will strike before it opens." From that moment, the dream became a countdown. Security was tightened. Inspections multiplied. Every bolt, every shipment, every worker's background was double-checked. Still, unease grew like smoke, invisible but everywhere. And yet, amidst the paranoia, the vision expanded. Where others saw factories, Traoré saw futures. He planned an entire ecosystem: textile schools, cotton refineries, distribution channels, all centered around one belief: that Africa should not just grow the raw, but own the finished. The old powers laughed at first, then they grew silent. Because by the time the final roof of the textile hub was welded into place, the numbers were undeniable. 20,000 tons of cotton processed annually, making it the largest, fully African-owned textile facility in modern history. The morning of its unveiling arrived like a storm held at bay. Journalists flew in from every continent. Drones hovered above the desert, capturing images of the silver complex, its towers glinting like armor under the sun. The people gathered for miles, some walking barefoot for days just to witness it. And among them, a young boy clutched a piece of raw cotton in his hand, a symbol passed down from his grandfather, who had died picking it for others. He raised it high as the music began. It should have been a perfect day. But not everyone in the crowd came to celebrate. Some had come to end it. The camera panned across a sea of faces, joyous, weary, uncertain, before settling on Traoré stepping toward the podium. Behind him, the giant banners rippled in the wind, the words shimmering in gold. Africa wears its own cloth. And beneath that light, beneath that triumph, the machinery of betrayal began to turn again, unseen, patient, inevitable. Behind every machine that hummed, the narrator's voice darkens. A darker mechanism was already turning, and what Traoré would uncover next would change Africa forever. The celebration faded quickly. By the next morning, the factory stood in silence, massive, gleaming, and strangely still. The flags were gone, the crowd dispersed. Only the hum of cooling metal lingered in the air, yet something in that stillness felt unnatural, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Traoré had built the dream, but dreams invite shadows, and somewhere deep within the newly finished plant, a switch had already been flipped, not to begin creation, but destruction. The first sign came as a whisper. A group of engineers noticed subtle inconsistencies in the control panels, a flicker of power drain, too minor to trigger alarms but steady enough to suggest tampering. When they investigated, they found nothing. No damaged wires, no signs of sabotage. Still, the current kept dipping, as though something unseen was feeding off the grid. Then came the second sign, a coded message intercepted by state intelligence, originating from an offshore server in Geneva. It contained only 5 words: "The threads must not bind." Within 24 hours, the rumors began. Foreign news outlets released identical reports claiming the textile hub systems were unsafe, that it had been constructed with stolen blueprints, that toxic byproducts were already leaking into nearby rivers. None of it was true, but in the world of perception, truth moves slower than accusation. Investors panicked. Inspections were demanded. The IMF issued a review of economic stability, and, quietly, sanctions loomed again, and through it all, Traoré said nothing. He spent his days walking the factory floors, watching, listening, memorizing the rhythm of his creation. Rows of looms lined the halls like mechanical soldiers, silent for now, waiting for command. The air smelled of cotton and heat. The workers' eyes followed him with quiet faith, but he knew faith was not protection. Weeks passed. The world had moved on, but Burkina Faso's tension had not. Deep beneath the optimism, there was a pulse of dread. Something was building. In the 3rd month, the hub suffered its first major failure. One of the main turbines, imported under mysterious delays, suddenly overloaded and burst, setting off a chain reaction that destroyed 2 adjacent generators. The explosion sent a plume of smoke rising high over the desert. No lives were lost, but the damage was catastrophic. Investigators called it mechanical error. The engineers disagreed. The wiring had been altered, expertly, deliberately. Someone had cut the power grid's heart. For the first time, the project halted, and with stillness came doubt. In the capital, debates turned bitter. Ministers who once cheered now questioned his leadership. Newspapers began publishing leaks, documents claiming the textile hub was draining state funds, that workers were unpaid, that Traoré was hiding a financial collapse. None of it was verified. All of it spread like wildfire. Foreign media amplified the chaos. Burkina Faso's industrial mirage, one headline read. A dream unravels, another said. It wasn't just an information war anymore. It was psychological siege. And as the economy wavered, ordinary people began to feel the pressure. The cost of food soared. Cotton farmers, once promised steady income, found themselves waiting for payments delayed by frozen accounts. Mothers stood in ration lines again. The same desperation that had given rise to the dream now returned to choke it. But in the heart of despair, something else stirred. A silent resistance among the people. Instead of turning against him, they began guarding the factory themselves. Farmers formed night patrols around the compound, armed with lanterns and sticks. Tailors from nearby villages stitched banners that read, "Let it stand." They didn't fully understand what was happening. They just knew this place mattered. It was theirs. And beneath the moon, under that shared desperation, the first cotton bales rolled once more into the processing units. Yet, unknown to them, the true battle was moving elsewhere, into the realm of secrecy and betrayal. Within the intelligence archives of Ouagadougou, an analyst uncovered encrypted files connected to the sabotage, data trails leading to offshore accounts, fake consultancy firms, and names that no one dared speak aloud. At the top of the list were the same 3 generals who had once smiled beside Traoré during the inauguration, They had been quietly channeling state resources into foreign accounts, selling information about the hub's inner workings, power diagrams, production schedules, access codes, and the buyers, entities linked to global textile conglomerates and lobbying groups based in Europe and Asia. The goal was simple: cripple the project before it could compete. But there was something else, something even darker. Buried within those encrypted exchanges was a plan labeled Operation Spindle. It wasn't about profit. It was about control. The plan outlined a sequence of covert disruptions, false flag industrial accidents, mass worker protests, and finally, a coup disguised as a stabilization measure. And at the center of it all was one directive: remove Traoré before the first shipment. By the time the report reached him, it was already too late to prevent the first phase. One night, as a cargo train carried the factory's initial batch of processed fabric toward the coast, it vanished somewhere along the northern railway. When search teams arrived, they found the train derailed, carriages burning, fabric turned to ash. No survivors among the gods. The world didn't react. But in Burkina Faso, the message was clear. The war had begun. Traoré's closest aides urged him to suspend operations, to declare a national emergency. But instead, he made a decision that would shock even his allies. He ordered the factory to reopen within 48 hours, no matter the cost. And so, with half its power, a fraction of its workers, and surrounded by ghosts, the textile hub came alive again. Each machine that moved was an act of rebellion. Each bolt tightened was a declaration of faith. They were no longer weaving cloth. They were weaving survival. But survival came at a cost. Inspections revealed strange modifications to the imported machines, hidden tracking chips, micro-drains on the network that uploaded data nightly to servers abroad. The discovery sent shockwaves through the intelligence unit. Someone inside the project had been feeding real-time production data to foreign companies, giving them access to blueprints, techniques, and output metrics before Burkina Faso itself even processed them. The betrayal wasn't just political, it was industrial espionage at a global scale, and the spy was still among them. The tension thickened. Workers began reporting strange incidents, computer screens flashing cryptic messages before going dark, unfamiliar technicians appearing on the grounds, blueprints disappearing from the archive room. Even the security cameras failed. One sector at a time, it was as though the factory itself was haunted by something that wanted to erase it from within. Meanwhile, the IMF doubled down, freezing development funds, issuing statements about irresponsible governance. Western outlets aired footage of the damaged generator, replaying it endlessly, framing it as proof of African mismanagement. But they didn't show the farmers rebuilding, the engineers repairing machines by hand, or the young apprentices sleeping inside the factory halls to keep it safe. Those stories didn't fit the narrative. Traoré grew quieter, more introspective. He began visiting the site alone, walking through the echoing chambers of steel and spinning fiber. Sometimes he would stop before the central loom, the largest in Africa, and simply listen. He said nothing, but his eyes seemed to speak a sentence the world would one day understand. If they burn one thread, we will weave 10 more. But even he could feel it, the air tightening around him. The invisible hand that moved through governments, media, and markets. The pressure was mounting towards something, a point of collapse or confrontation. Then came the drought. The cotton fields that fed the hub began to wither under relentless sun. Rivers dried, villages went thirsty. It was nature's cruelty layered over political sabotage, and to the people, it felt like the earth itself had turned against them. Famine crept quietly across the land. Children grew thinner. The songs of the farmers faded. And in the midst of all this, the factory, once a symbol of rebirth, now loomed like a question. Was it salvation, or was it curse? Foreign commentators called it Traoré's hubris. But for those who still believed, it was the last light left burning. They refused to let it die. One night, as the drought deepened and fear spread, a convoy of trucks approached the factory gates. Their cargo was not cotton, but something else. Generators, supplies, medical aid, all from neighboring nations who had quietly defied Western pressure. Mali, Niger, Guinea, countries who saw in Traoré's defiance the echo of their own struggle. The aid arrived in silence, without headlines, under cover of darkness. But its meaning was enormous. Africa had begun to stand with itself. And somewhere, the anonymous source who had once sent him the warning, "They will strike before it opens," sent another message. This time a single phrase: "The storm is ready." The storm came, not in the form of rain, but of revelation. Intelligence finally decrypted the full contents of Operation Spindle. It confirmed what Traoré had suspected all along. The factory wasn't the real target. It was a symbol. If it fell, Africa's momentum toward independence would crumble with it. It wasn't about cotton. It was about control of narrative, pride and possibility. And somewhere in the desert, where cotton once grew wild and untamed, the air trembled with tension, the feeling of history about to turn. They had tried to drown the continent in its own dust, the narration whispers, but dust remembers who walks upon it. And soon that dust would rise. The machines hummed again. The people waited. And in the heart of the textile hub, where fabric met fire, Ibrahim Traoré prepared for the confrontation that would decide not just a factory, but a future. Night fell like ink over the desert. The factory loomed against the horizon, a giant of steel and smoke, pulsing faintly with red light. Every window was dark, except one, at the top of the Central Operations Tower, where Traoré stood alone. He had received the decrypted files hours earlier. The truth was worse than betrayal. It was orchestration. Operation Spindle was no rumor. It was a map of destruction, and every line led here. The coup wasn't coming. It had already begun. Outside, the desert winds howled, lifting waves of dust that swallowed the stars. The guards at the perimeter reported unusual movement, vehicles without identification plates circling the factory's outskirts. Communications cut in and out. Power flickered. It was the eve of the factory's first shipment, the moment meant to prove Africa could stand on its own. And that was exactly why they came for him now. Just after midnight, the first strike hit. An explosion ripped through the western loading bay, the blast sending a tower of flame high into the night. Metal screamed. Alarms blared. Workers scrambled for cover as fire rolled across the storage area. The first section of the textile hub was burning. The attack was surgical, too precise to be random. Within minutes, 2 other sections went dark, severed from the grid. Whoever planned it knew the factory's layout perfectly. Traoré descended from the tower into the smoke-filled corridors. The emergency lights flickered red against the steel walls. Each step echoed with distant chaos, shouting, running, machinery grinding to a halt. But he didn't stop. At the control center, the monitors showed what he already knew. The hub was under siege. The main gate had been breached. Trucks filled with armed men were pouring into the compound, firing at guard towers and torching cotton bales. They wore no insignia, their faces hidden. Burkina Faso's security forces scrambled to respond, but communications were jammed. The attackers had silenced the network. And still, through the smoke and confusion, Traoré remained calm. He gave no orders, raised no weapon. He moved like someone who already understood that survival was not his goal. Endurance was. As the fighting raged, something strange began to happen inside the factory. Instead of fleeing, dozens of workers, men and women, stayed. They shut the blast doors, sealed off the spinning halls, and started the looms manually. The hum of machines rose beneath the roar of gunfire. Threads began to move again, glowing faintly in the emergency light. No one told them to. They simply refused to let the factory die. The first roll of cotton fabric came out torn and blackened with soot, but it was fabric nonetheless. It was proof. The heart still beat. The attackers didn't understand it at first. They had expected panic, not defiance. When they broke through the inner gate, they found not soldiers, but workers standing shoulder to shoulder, holding tools, rods, and even half-spun spindles like weapons. The battle was uneven, but it wasn't ordinary. Every blow, every movement carried something ancient, the will of a people who had nothing left to lose but their dignity. By dawn, the ground outside the factory was littered with burning vehicles. The sky had turned gray with smoke, but the assault wasn't over. It had only shifted. From the north, a second wave approached. This time, not soldiers, but sabotage cloaked as salvation. A convoy of armored trucks bearing international emblems arrived at the checkpoint, claiming to be peacekeepers sent to contain the unrest. The guards hesitated. Their credentials looked legitimate, but Traoré knew better. The documents carried the same insignia seen in the decrypted files, the false humanitarian front named in Operation Spindle. He ordered them stopped. When the guards refused them entry, the trucks rammed the gates. Hidden explosives inside the cargo detonated seconds later, blowing apart half the eastern wall. The blast ripped through the power lines, plunging the entire complex into darkness. For a moment, everything stopped. No light, no sound, just the groan of collapsing steel. And then, from the darkness, a single generator sparked to life. Its weak glow illuminated the central hall, where Traoré stood surrounded by smoke and dust, looking out over what remained of the dream he had built. He could have fled then. He could have abandoned it all. But instead, he moved to the manual override and switched the remaining looms to emergency power. Slowly, painfully, the machines began to move again. The sound was faint at first, just the clicking of spindles, the trembling of belts. But soon it grew louder, spreading through the halls like a pulse. Workers re-emerged from the shadows, faces streaked with ash, hands raw, eyes bright. Together, they kept the machines alive. Outside, the attackers regrouped, confused by the unrelenting noise. They had destroyed most of the facility, but the machines kept running. From a distance, it looked like a ghost factory. Fire and smoke above, but rhythm below. When reinforcements from the Burkina Faso army finally arrived at dawn, they found chaos, scattered vehicles, wreckage, and survivors standing amid twisted steel. The attackers were gone, retreating toward the border, leaving only destruction behind. But they hadn't taken what they came for. The factory still stood. Traoré walked among the ruins as the sun rose. The ground was blackened, but the heart of the hub, the main production wing, had survived. From within, the loom still turned, weaving smoke-stained fabric that fluttered weakly in the heat. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't pretty, but it was alive. By mid-morning, the extent of the sabotage became clear. Systems destroyed, records wiped, communications down. Yet in the ashes, there was something else. Evidence. The investigators found a half-melted tablet near one of the vehicles. Its encrypted data matched the signatures from the leaked Operation Spindle files. The coordinates of offshore accounts, the names of intermediaries, even correspondence between foreign consultants and the three generals were all there. It was irrefutable proof that the sabotage had been orchestrated by global interests with local collaborators. News of the discovery spread faster than censorship could contain it. Across Africa, independent journalists began publishing the documents. Within days, the world saw what had been hidden. That the same institutions preaching development had secretly funded the destruction of one of Africa's first independent industrial projects. Protests erupted across cities in Mali, Ghana, and Senegal. Crowds carried torn pieces of cloth, remnants of the hub's fabric, as flags of resistance. And inside Burkina Faso, thousands marched to the capital. Not in anger, but in unity. They weren't demanding aid. They were demanding dignity. Traoré stayed at the factory throughout. He didn't give a speech. He didn't appear on television. He simply worked alongside the engineers, helping to repair the damaged looms. The fire had scorched half the facility, but the other half began operating within a week. The first new batch of fabric rolled out quietly, coarse, imperfect, still smelling faintly of smoke. But this time, every roll was stamped with a seal no foreign corporation could erase. Made in Burkina Faso, owned by Africa. The message spread like wildfire. Textile unions across the continent reached out, offering collaboration. Mali sent raw cotton. Guinea shipped dyes. Even diaspora communities in Europe and Asia began promoting the fabric of freedom, as it came to be called. The IMF froze its next sanction review, uncertain whether it could still control the narrative. The corporations implicated in the leaks issued denials that no one believed. And yet, despite the apparent victory, the cost was visible. Dozens had died. Hundreds were injured. The factory was a scar, a monument built from suffering. Still, it stood. Weeks later, a storm swept across the desert. Rain fell for the first time in months, pounding against the metal roofs. The wind howled through the broken windows, scattering ash into the air. But through it all, the machines kept moving, powered by backup generators and human will. The cotton fields began to bloom again, faint green against the wet soil. The rivers filled. The drought broke. The first completed shipment left the factory under military escort, bolts of fabric bound for neighboring countries. Each crate bore a simple label, not for sale, for solidarity. It wasn't commerce, it was declaration. At the same hour that convoy crossed the border, a broadcast went live across African state channels. Not a speech, just footage. Aerial shots of the textile hub at dawn, smoke rising gently from its chimneys. Workers in uniforms cleaning debris, stitching torn banners back together. The camera lingered on the central courtyard, where new threads were drying in the sun, red, green, and gold. The narrator's voice was calm. They came to silence a factory, but they awakened a continent. The image faded to black. In the following days, global reaction divided. Western commentators framed it as nationalism disguised as industry. But others saw something deeper, a psychological shift, a fracture in the hierarchy that had long dictated what Africa could build and own. Burkina Faso, once a nation whispered about only in reports and statistics, had forced its way into the headlines, not through war, but through creation. For the people, it wasn't politics anymore, it was pride. The textile hub, battered and blackened, had become a symbol. Each thread that left its machines carried a message far beyond fabric, that even in a world built to exploit, creation was resistance. Night returned to the desert. The fires were gone now, replaced by quiet. Inside the main hall, a single loom still turned, slow and steady, weaving cloth that shimmered in the faint light. Traoré stood nearby, watching the threads interlace, white and gold, plain yet luminous. Around him the air smelled of cotton and smoke, of ruin and rebirth. He reached out and touched the fabric. It was rough, imperfect, like everything worth saving. He looked out over the factory floor where men and women still worked, despite exhaustion. And somewhere in that stillness, the impossible became visible. The moment when destruction gave birth to resolve. The hub had survived. The dream was wounded, but breathing. And the world, for the first time in decades, was watching Africa, not for its failure, but for its defiance. Morning crept over Ouagadougou with the quiet of a city recovering from trauma. The streets still bore the scars of unrest, shattered windows, scorched walls, posters torn from concrete. Yet something in the air had changed. It wasn't fear anymore. It was focus. In schools, teachers told their students about the night the cotton hub refused to burn. In cafes, people spoke not of politics or aid, but of production, of thread, counts, of looms, of how long it might take before every village had its own mill. The rebellion had shifted from the streets to the factories. Traoré's government, though battered, stood unbroken. The international sanctions that had threatened to choke the nation were now under scrutiny after the release of the Operation Spindle files. Suddenly, those who had called him radical were forced to address a harder question. What if he had been right all along? In the weeks following the attack, the textile hub transformed into something more than an industrial site. It became pilgrimage ground. Farmers from across Burkina Faso came with cotton bales strapped to carts and motorcycles. Engineers from Ghana, students from Mali, even artisans from Ethiopia arrived, offering skills and hands. They came not for pay, but for participation, to be part of something that for once was truly theirs. The rebuilding was relentless. The sound of welding, hammering, and spinning filled the air day and night. Women cooked for the workers under makeshift tents. Children played among the rolls of fabric. Songs emerged, hymns in Mossi and Dioula, about threads stronger than steel. By the third month, the first complete production cycle was restored. The machinery ran at 70% capacity. Every roll of fabric bore that same emblem: made in Burkina Faso, owned by Africa. And for the first time, it wasn't just a slogan. It was a contract written in labor, sealed with sacrifice. Outside the continent, however, a storm brewed. Corporate lobbies in Paris and Brussels held emergency sessions. The African textile independence movement threatened multi-billion-dollar supply chains built on cheap export and dependency. For decades, Africa had been the field, not the factory. Now, that hierarchy was trembling. News agencies began framing Traoré as the industrial rebel. Some Western commentators called him a populist, others a visionary. But beneath all, the noise, something undeniable was unfolding. A new axis of power built not on guns, but on machines. China offered technical aid. Turkey proposed partnership. Russia sent engineers to upgrade the power systems. And for the first time in modern African history, deals were being signed on African terms. Within 6 months, the cotton hub expanded. 3 smaller satellite mills were established in Bobo Dioulasso, Kaya, and Fada. Together, they created an industrial chain capable of processing 20,000 tons of cotton into fabric annually, not for export, but for African manufacturers. Tailors' cooperatives sprang up across cities. Burkina Faso's domestic clothing industry, once reliant on imports, began supplying uniforms, workwear, and traditional textiles. The shift rippled outward. Mali sent word it was reviving its old dyeing centers. Ghana began restoring abandoned textile mills. Nigeria reopened long idle cotton fields. It was more than economics. It was restoration of identity. The loom became a flag. In Ouagadougou's National Square, a mural appeared overnight. It showed a single thread stretching across the African continent, from the cotton fields of Burkina Faso to the harbors of Senegal, looping through Cairo and Nairobi, binding them together. Beneath it, the words were simple: one thread, one Africa. Children painted its edges. Soldiers saluted it as they passed. Even the critics who had once called the factory a vanity project began to fall silent. Because the numbers spoke louder than politics. Thousands of new jobs. A drop in textile imports. An increase in rural wages. And for the first time in years, migration slowed. People weren't fleeing poverty anymore. They were staying to build. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, Traoré stood again on the balcony of the rebuilt operations tower. The air smelled of cotton and fresh rain. Below him, the factory hummed, alive, unafraid. He wasn't the same man who had cut the ribbon months earlier. The night of the attack had changed him, stripped him of illusions. Yet what remained was sharper, quieter, more enduring. He looked down at the workers, women rolling fabric, men guiding carts, young engineers checking turbines. They no longer looked to him for direction. They had found their own rhythm, their own ownership. That was the victory, not dependence on a savior, but the awakening of self-sufficiency. The next morning, a quiet announcement was made. Burkina Faso would begin exporting its first batch of finished textiles to African Union nations, with a clause forbidding resale outside the continent. It was a small clause, but it sent shockwaves through the global market. Major brands accused Traoré of protectionism. Trade alliances threatened tariffs. Analysts warned of economic isolation. But he didn't respond. He didn't need to. The demand within Africa was already greater than what they could produce. For once, Africa wasn't waiting to be invited to the table. It was building its own. At the factory's reopening ceremony, no foreign dignitaries were present. No international media was invited. The event was streamed live by local students using donated cameras. Under a canopy of patched cloth, Traoré addressed the crowd. His words were measured, plain. They tried to burn cotton, not knowing it grows in fire. The crowd fell silent, then erupted into applause. That line would later become the slogan of a continental movement. Cotton grows in fire. It appeared on shirts, posters, and banners across Africa. It became a metaphor not just for Burkina Faso, but for every nation that had survived exploitation and found strength in ruin. Months passed. The textile hub reached full operation. What began as a single project had evolved into an idea too large to contain. Across Africa, leaders and laborers alike began asking the same question. If Burkina Faso can do this, why not us? In Ethiopia, an old mill was restored. In Ghana, a defunct plant reopened. In Nigeria, youth cooperatives began hand-spinning cotton again, and slowly, a quiet revolution formed, not through speeches, but through production. The continent's greatest act of defiance wasn't protest, it was manufacture. Outside forces tried to undermine it still. Rumors spread, markets fluctuated, embargoes threatened, but something fundamental had shifted: trust. Africa had rediscovered belief, not in governments, not in investors, but in work, in the dignity of making. The hub's output reached its goal, 20,000 tons of fabric a year. But what mattered wasn't the number, it was the meaning. Each meter of cloth was more than fiber, it was evidence that the colonized could construct. From Bamako to Dar es Salaam, tailors stitched school uniforms, flags, and garments from that same cotton. The fabric became a symbol of unity, durable, simple, unmistakably African. Years later, long after the dust had settled, the desert around the factory turned green. The irrigation canals built to support the cotton fields had transformed the landscape into fertile plains. Villages grew nearby, schools opened, and at the center of it all, the factory remained, humming, constant, unbroken. Students on field trips walked its halls, guided by veterans of the first rebuild. They learned not just about machines or agriculture, but about defiance, how one night of fire could ignite a generation. The global economy eventually adapted. The corporations that once tried to crush the project now sought partnership. They offered to collaborate, to modernize production. Some deals were accepted, on equal terms. Others were refused. The difference was simple. Africa now had the power to choose. For the first time in modern history, the narrative had flipped. Burkina Faso wasn't begging for aid. The world was negotiating for access. In the capital, the Textile Museum opened with a simple exhibition, the first roll of fabric ever produced during the night of the attack, still scorched at the edges. Beneath it, a plaque read, "From ashes we wove." Visitors came from every nation. Some left in silence. Others wept, because in that piece of burned cotton lay the story of more than one country. It was the story of resilience itself. Years later, when the hub expanded into a continental trade alliance, the original plant was declared a heritage site. Its central hall was preserved as it was, the cracked walls, the soot marks, the worn floors. No one repaired them. They were left as testimony. On the anniversary of its founding, a new flag was raised above the tower, plain white, woven from locally grown cotton. No symbols, no slogans, just cloth, because in that simplicity lay everything the revolution had meant. Night again covered the desert, softer now, almost kind. The machine slowed as the workers left. The wind carried the faint smell of fabric through the empty streets. In the stillness, the hum of the last loom lingered, the same rhythm that had survived gunfire, sabotage and storm. And somewhere in the dark, a voice, not of a leader or a soldier, but of a worker, whispered the words that had become their prayer. We build, therefore we exist. The world had watched Africa rise through empire, through blood, through chains. But now it watched something different, a quiet power, steady and self-forged. From the fields of Burkina Faso to the ports of Dakar, the sound of looms filled the nights. Cotton turned to fabric, Fabric turned to pride, and pride, finally, turned to permanence. The desert had changed. Years after the fire, the floods, the sabotage, and the sabotage attempts that followed, the land around Ouagadougou was alive again. Rivers that once ran dry now curved through green plains. Cotton fields stretched endlessly, white under the sun, bunched into neat rows that promised harvest after harvest. The factories hummed in rhythm with the earth, as if the soil itself had agreed to this partnership. Traoré walked along one of the irrigation canals, his boots stirring the mud. The air smelled of damp earth and raw cotton. He was older now, but the steel in his eyes remained. His hands, once clean and precise, were roughened from years of work and negotiation, from planting and repairing, from fighting unseen enemies in boardrooms and deserts alike. He had built a nation of threads, a fabric not only of cotton, but of resilience. The textile hub had become more than a factory. It was a symbol, a school, a network, a heartbeat. Local governments replicated the model. Mali's dyeing centers revived. Ghana's mills reopened. Nigeria's textile cooperatives flourished. Small villages that had once lost all hope now sent apprentices to learn in Ouagadougou, carrying seeds and stories back home. Africa's first continental textile supply chain was no longer an experiment. It was a functioning reality. Every bolt of cloth leaving the hub carried not just fiber, but a message. Africa could create, govern, and prosper on its own terms. International reactions were slower than the continent's movements, but impossible to ignore. Corporate conglomerates that had once funded sabotage were now requesting partnerships. Governments that had doubted the hub's viability sought technical knowledge. Trade associations that had imposed embargoes reconsidered. The world had underestimated the quiet power of an idea born in resilience, executed with precision and protected with courage. Within Burkina Faso, the impact was profound. The economy stabilized. Rural wages increased. Schools reopened. Markets flourished with locally made textiles, reducing reliance on imports. Women's cooperatives thrived, sewing not only uniforms but clothing lines sold regionally. The fabric became more than cloth. It became currency of culture, pride, and independence. It represented a continent no longer waiting for permission to succeed. Even children felt it. In classrooms, they wove small strips of cotton into bracelets and flags. In playgrounds, they stitched pieces together for fun, unconsciously practicing the art of self-reliance. And when asked about their future, they no longer spoke of leaving, they spoke of building. Traoré rarely gave interviews. When he did, he spoke sparingly. The media dubbed him the industrial visionary, but he cared little for titles. He cared about permanence, about leaving something that could not be erased. In the evenings, he would walk the factory floor alone, listening to the hum of the looms. He watched apprentices learning the craft. He saw women threading needles with care. He observed engineers recalibrating machinery without guidance. Each motion was proof that the dream was no longer his alone. It belonged to everyone. One afternoon, a shipment of fabric left for Nairobi, bound for cooperative tailors who would distribute it across East Africa. The first batch, modest but meaningful, carried the emblem sewn into every meter, made in Burkina Faso, owned by Africa. It was more than branding. It was a declaration. As the trucks rolled across the savannah, traders and journalists noted the speed, the efficiency, the sheer audacity of it. Africa had produced not just cloth, but a network, a movement. Meanwhile, the architects of the previous sabotage attempts found themselves exposed. Investigations revealed hidden networks of corporate and political interference. Some fled, some were arrested. Others quietly retreated, forced to reconsider their calculations. Traoré, however, made no threats. He left justice in the hands of law. His focus was elsewhere, on growth, sustainability, and teaching others how to build independently. Because he understood something fundamental. Power born of creation could never be destroyed entirely. Across the continent, nations began replicating the Burkina Faso model. Local industries that had languished for decades suddenly saw possibility. Small farmers formed cooperatives to supply hubs. Artisans gained fair wages for their work. Entire communities flourished, all tied together by the hum of spinning machines, and the flow of cotton across borders. The hub became a beacon, not for profit alone, but for possibility. International media eventually framed the story as a miracle. Economists analyzed it, NGOs studied it, but the people who lived it never called it miraculous. They called it survival. They called it ownership. They called it Africa. Years later, on the anniversary of the hub's launch, a ceremony was held. There were no foreign dignitaries, no cameras from global media outlets. The celebration was for the people, farmers, tailors, engineers, students, and workers, every hand that had touched the factory in its trials. Traoré stood on a platform looking over the crowd. He spoke once, in a voice firm yet gentle. We were told we could not. We were told we would fail. But we built, and in building, we found ourselves. The crowd erupted in applause. Children waved fabric scraps. Mothers held up newly sewn garments. Even the desert seemed to sway in recognition of the moment. It was not just a celebration. It was affirmation. The hub continued to expand, eventually incorporating research centers, training programs, and distribution networks. Apprenticeships for young engineers became prestigious. African fashion designers used the hub's output to compete on international runways. The first shipment of fully African-made clothing to the European market sold out, earning praise for quality and design. Every bolt of fabric carried a story of survival, defiance, and vision. Traoré's legacy, though still in the making, became tangible. He was no longer just a military figure or political leader. He was an industrial pioneer, a symbol of self-determination, a living testament to the principle that creation itself can resist oppression. The scarred factory walls remained untouched, preserved as a monument. Visitors walked through the main hall, now lined with images of workers and farmers who had rebuilt it. Signs told the story of the sabotage, the fires, the drought, and the recovery. And at the center, the looms continued their work, constant, unwavering. The continent watched, inspired. Borders no longer constrained imagination. Young entrepreneurs studied the model. New industrial hubs sprouted across West and East Africa. The dream that had survived bullets, fire, and corruption became a blueprint for independence. Traoré himself rarely appeared in the press. He didn't need to. The machines, the fields, the workers, the finished fabric, they spoke louder than any interview ever could. And in that hum of looms, in the rustle of cotton, there was a quiet question that hung in the air, unspoken but understood. If one nation can weave its own future, why not all of Africa? The sun set over Ouagadougou. The factory chimneys glowed faintly against the orange sky. Birds circled, returning to their nests in the newly planted trees. Children ran through the cotton fields, laughing, playing with threads that once carried desperation and fear. Traoré walked among them, hands resting lightly on the shoulders of the next generation. He looked at the horizon and smiled, not for himself, but for the continent, for the people who had refused to let hope die. From destruction had come creation. From sabotage had come resilience. From cotton had come freedom, and Africa, at long last, was weaving its own destiny.